Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Let's begin this week-long inquiry with the most basic question. One, fairly easy to formulate, but also extremely difficult to answer adequately. And that's the task that I've set for myself this morning, to answer this seemingly easy question, but which through the 1920s and 1930s confounded no shortage of historians. And that is, why did the United States belatedly enter World War I in April of 1917? After all, that war had been going on in Europe ever since August of 1914 for over 2.5 years, while the United States stayed on the sidelines. Seems an innocent question, but it had profound complications, the answering of it, for how we approach the next World War, because allegedly the lessons and truths of those years 1914 to 1917 informed how we fashioned and crafted our foreign policy in response to the rise of Adolf Hitler and fascism. World War I, as I think Jennifer and Wayne will document in abundant detail, cast a long and dark shadow throughout the 20s and the 30s. Ironically, during Easter Holy Week, God is a prankster, President Woodrow Wilson requested of Congress a declaration of war. At the time, his cabinet, these are important facts because to appreciate the shift in public opinion, you have to see how powerful the consensus was by April of 1917 that sending troop ships to Europe was in fact the proper and the wise course of action. His cabinet was unanimous for war. In fact, they had been berating Woodrow Wilson, a most reluctant advocate of war. Woodrow Wilson sought to the very end to avoid committing American troops to Europe. He preferred, given his own self-image, about which I will have more to say later in the week, he preferred to use our extraordinary leverage over the Allies to mediate a peace. In fact, he saw himself as being called at this time to bring peace to the world, a lasting and just peace. And so it is only at the very end that he finally reluctantly caves in to overwhelming counsel and asks for declaration of war. Overwhelmingly, the House of Representatives agreed with the cabinet, and they did so on Good Friday. The vote in the chamber was 373 to 50. Over in the Senate, approval of the war resolution was equally lopsided, 82 to 6. In other words, only a tiny percentage on Capitol Hill thought that the president's request was an unholy one. Just 1 in 10 congressmen voted no, voted for peace, in other words. Just a quick autopsy reveals that senatorial opposition was top-heavy, as you might expect, with Midwesterners. It's where most German Americans lived. Of 92 million Americans at the time, if the Census Bureau is to be believed and its projections and extrapolations, roughly 9 to 10% of the population were ethnically German American. By the way, this is one of the true oddities of World War I, that the largest ethnic group became the object of witch hunting and vigilantism to the point where who knows today whether your name is Smith or Schmidt? Because under pressure of 100% Americans and returning veterans and various other vigilante groups who wanted to demonstrate their patriotism, German Americans suffered considerable abuse and violation of their civil rights. Silly things. Sauerkraut renamed Liberty Cabbage, because we would go through that you know, later, French and freedom fries. We have this irresistible urge towards silliness as a people. That senatorial opposition, top-heavy with Midwesterners as it was, largely a function of the German-American base in the Midwest, but also because the Midwest really did have great ambivalence toward the people who lived on both coasts and weren't prepared to follow them necessarily whenever they indicated it was time to move. That senatorial opposition had as its acknowledged leader a man named Robert La Follette. And a fellow Badger is here, I know, and Robert La Follette still looms large in the history of that state of Wisconsin. But there's another perspective. Memorably, Theodore Roosevelt called La Follette a fellow progressive. On domestic issues, they tended to see eye to eye. But when it came to voting against the war, Theodore Roosevelt called La Follette a skunk who ought to be hung for voting no. That, by the way, is vintage TR. He was a gifted wordsmith and mudslinger and name caller, and a guy who coined the expression muckraker knew a good deal about raking up some muck on occasion. By the way, the Midwest would remain the stronghold of isolationism in America right up until the late 1940s, when George Marshall decided that he had to go out on the hustings and sell the Marshall Plan. His great dread was that he was going to run into the likes of Colonel Robert McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and all the people who read avidly the Chicago Tribune, and find that only opposition to internationalism would be found in the Midwest. Eventually, that stronghold of isolationism thinned out. It weakened. It's never gone. It's still there if you go to the small towns of the Midwest. The big reason that isolationism, I think, was so durable, and so many Americans in 1914 were against being dragged into the European conflict, is an attitude that goes back to John Quincy Adams, who once said, and I think captured a general 19th century American attitude toward the rest of the world. Some would call it the voice of the Pharisee. That America was the sea of virtue surrounded by an ocean of iniquity and corruption. That is to say, what Europeans scratch their head at, although they have their own version, is this American sense of exceptionalism. That we are different. Not only are we different, we're morally superior. We're more virtuous. What's going on in Europe in World War I is the result of the kind of corruption that attends aristocrats and autocrats and kings and queens and royalty. We're the new and improved version of Europe. We've learned how not to do it. So there is a powerful sales resistance to getting involved in World War I. All we're going to do is to corrupt ourselves by proximity to the Europeans. Secondly, there's a long-standing tradition in America also going back to the Monroe Doctrine, and it's sort of a corollary of this Pharisaical attitude, that on the one hand, there's one sphere, it's our sphere, and there's another sphere on the globe, and that's Europe, and never the twain shall meet. One of the reasons Wilson had such a tough time getting revisions in the League Covenant was he wanted to have the Europeans certify the Monroe Doctrine. It was one of the indispensable demands made by Henry Cabot Lodge. So there are powerful cultural dispositions, sensibilities at work in America in 1914, militating against involvement in the European War. But at least we can say that this congressional consensus that existed in April of 1917 during Holy Week reflected accurately the public mood. Whether the vote was right or wrong, and I hope that during this week we at least get down to the gravamen of the issue. And was it a correct decision to get involved? And was it an incorrect decision? And why? The jury is not necessarily, even 100 years later, out on that one. Okay? The court of public opinion still is in session. But whether it was right or wrong, the mood god of public opinion, that great tyrant in the American democracy, the mood god of public opinion, did prevail. When guns first erupted in Europe, America's public mood had been decidedly different. Another consensus existed. Don't entangle yourself in this European mess. And the great majority agreed that there seemed to be no vital national interest at stake over there. And yet, Europe was the cradle of our civilization at that time. America would change dramatically in the late 20th century. Peoples would come from different parts of the world, causing considerable uneasiness in America to this day. But when World War I broke out, it was a generally homogeneous European base to the culture. Indeed, in late summer 1914, more seemed at stake in a hot pennant race in the American League between the Boston Red Sox and Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics. And yes, this would be a good time to get this off my chest. Patrick, his name was Cornelius McGillicuddy, and he did wear a three-piece suit as he managed in the dugout. At any rate, it seemed to Americans that more was at stake in this, and baseball was then truly America's pastime. So all obsessive-compulsive disorders focused on baseball instead of football and basketball, and our mania with sport was channeled into one national pastime. But it seemed to Americans that that was more important, whether the Red Sox beat the Philadelphia Athletics, than whether the German army cutting across neutral Belgium to crush France would ever get there. And of course, they never did get to Paris. A postscript. That summer, 19-year-old Babe Ruth played in 5 games for the Red Sox. He pitched in 4 of them. He didn't hit a single home run. The Babe, though, went on to revolutionize the game of baseball, not with his arm, but with his bat. While America's foreign and military policies would be much, much slower to change old habits. Baseball, once again, was out in front in revolutionizing American attitudes and American ways. That going on in Europe was a typical example one could hear in a imaginary conversation on Main Street between John Q. and John A. Public. What could be heard is this sense, it's old world folly. Let them consume themselves in their own misguided ways. They deserve it. They can't get rid of those feudal trappings. They can't get rid of kings and queens. And God, have you ever seen pictures of Kaiser Wilhelm and his family marching down the street in Berlin with feathers flying? And man, it's medieval. No, as Dick Nixon would say, good old Republican cloth coats. No. But Americans, by the way, at this time, are shaped by factors they're unwilling to let surface. Most that's important, I think, in how Americans think about themselves remains submerged. They have the luxury of that large moat, the Atlantic Ocean. And you know how much that security that they receive from that large moat costs? Nothing. And the American self-image has largely in the late 19th, early 20th century been shaped by this conception of free security. It would cost this shield of the Republic. It would cost money. But in the 19th century, early 20th century, the Pacific and the Atlantic provided remarkable security. And then there's that anti-military sentiment. It runs strong in Zanesville and Dubuque. Very strong. A large standing army is to many the bane of the Republic. It's a constant threat to foreign adventure, constant threat to domestic liberties. And therefore, unlike our European cousins, we ought not to have a large standing army. A navy? One of the reasons the Navy became so modern and revered is it didn't fit the same anxiety that the Army did, the standing army. By the way, this is something that Tin Pan Alley very insightfully understood. One of the biggest musical hits of 1915 was I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. I didn't. In fact, when Henry Ford is leaving in December of 1915, a topic, his peace ship that I'll get into tomorrow, the thousands and thousands of cheering people, including Thomas Edison and John Burroughs on the wharf at Hoboken, they're singing loudly this Tin Pan Alley hit, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. Its lyrics said it all. Quote, there'd be no war today if mothers all would say, really sophisticated line, sort of like doo-wop, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. So you've got to get inside the American sensibility. We're good. They're corrupt. They're fallen. We're the city on the hill. We're the beacon. If they'd just take the illumination, they could head down the proper path. It makes us different. It has been the source of puzzlement to Europeans to this very day. The bulk of Americans had the luxury of believing, moreover, that the Allies would triumph over the Central Powers. If you were a betting man, if you were taking book, most Americans said, we don't have to get involved, because the Allies are going to win anyway. So this is one of those hidden safety nets as we slowly move toward a commitment in 1917 to the Allies. So there's no need existing to re-examine old prejudices, especially this attachment to the notion of a two spheres that went back, to John Quincy Adams. Oh, there were critics of government policy because Woodrow Wilson decided that the only way to deal with the situation in Europe was to adopt a policy of supposedly strict neutrality. I use that advisedly and in quotation marks because you'll see before we adjourn today that this was anything but strict neutrality. It was strict neutrality in theory that in practice was exceedingly benevolent neutrality toward the Allies. And that, of course, gives rise in the 1930s, not the only taproot, but one of the major taproots for this vast conspiracy theory that captures the minds of the most trained as well as the least trained minds in the country. Wilson's policy of strict neutrality elicited sharp criticism, but only in a very narrow slice of the public. Critics of government policy, so there certainly were. And not surprisingly, Theodore Roosevelt was the most outspoken hawk and the greatest of the Wilson bashers of the period 1914 to 1917. I think you'd agree with me that while he was alive, he was certainly the poster boy for all alpha males, Theodore Roosevelt. And I think it also reasonable to conclude that Teddy never really needed treatment for low T. He definitely didn't need any treatment for low T. This is strenuous, muscular America. War is glorified, and man is tested, not in the flabby materialism of making a buck, but in the romantic contest of one person against another in battle. And by the way, he passed this sensibility effectively down to his sons, all of whom fought in World War I. And indeed, one of the two father-son combinations who would get what? Medal of Honor, along with the MacArthurs. While TR never issued an outright call for intervention, rhetorically he was always spoiling for a fight, forever gushing about Belgians' misfortune. And by the way, this is exhibit A of hypocrisy. This Theodore Roosevelt, who didn't have any great respect for legal niceties and who said in a speech in Berkeley, California in 1911, I took the Panama Canal and I let the Congress debate it. And now he's all torn up about the violation by Germany of Belgium's neutrality. So TR is not a man like all of us, terribly consistent. He thinks of it as the hobgoblin of little minds, that consistency. So he's troubled about Belgium's misfortune, and he wants to punish, if not punch, the Kaiser for violating Belgian neutrality and sinking the Lusitania. And he's also the most vocal advocate of national preparedness. What a pummeling Wilson took at TR's hands. And to nobody's surprise, when Wilson finally asked for a declaration of war and the Congress agrees, Roosevelt comes sheepishly to the White House asking the commander-in-chief, could he please lead a battalion on the Western Front? And Wilson has this delight in sending him away, saying, I don't return this mudslinging with kindness. TR lashed Wilson. He called him yellow. At least he didn't liken his backbone to that of a chocolate eclair, which he did of William McKinley on the run-up to the Spanish-American War. That's a nice metaphor, huh? Backbone of chocolate eclair? Yeah. TR had a way. He had a way. Ever the clever wordsmith and professional name-caller, he savaged the former professor as the schoolmaster. And it was as pejorative a turn as he could think. He claimed he was less patriotic than James Buchanan. It's going a long way. And he attacked him and his pacifist Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. Yes, we had a pacifist as a Secretary of State. The boy orator from the Platte, William Jennings Bryan. He called them both high priests in the, quote, cult of cowardice, unquote. Wilson's future nemesis, Henry Cabot Lodge, sided with his friend TR, but those who sided in turn with TR and Lodge were decidedly a small minority. Their number was fairly minuscule, and they were not in the mainstream. Despite TR's thunder and his demonizing of Woodrow Wilson, the public would not be moved. So all of these remarkable oratorical skills that TR had went for naught. He was the voice, he was vox clamantis in deserto. He was the voice crying out in the wilderness. Nobody was listening. America remained dead set against involvement in Europe's war until early 1917. That is to say, we do not slowly migrate toward a commitment. It happens with an abruptness in early 1917. Now, I want to, before I go any further, give you a caveat about public opinion, since it looms fairly large in this analysis and its impact on foreign policy. Not until 1935, when George Gallup created the American Institute of Public Opinion, did polling come of age. That we know it didn't really come of age, because the following year the Literary Digest predicted that Alf Landon would beat Franklin Roosevelt. So they hadn't really gotten it all together yet. The instruments were fairly crude. Before 1935, though, measuring the way people thought and believed was an inexact science. Instruments for measurement prior to 1935 were crude. So, however important, the notion of public opinion has to be used advisedly in the era of World War I. For those years, it's more a matter of impression than of hard empirical data. It generally boiled down to editorial opinions in newspapers, letters to the editor, as well as letters and telegrams and petitions to congressmen. As always, silence, though, is ambiguous, which a future president, Richard Nixon, well understood. Amidst a later war in Vietnam, he rested his own foreign policy on America's so-called silent majority. It's a wonderfully elastic term, silent majority. It's silent, so I choose to read into it what it doesn't say. It's good, very good. By April 1917, the prevailing attitude found back in August of 1914 was no longer discernible. As measured by imperfect devices, public opinion has shifted dramatically. A reluctant president and an eager Congress agreed to abandon the official policy of neutralism. So why? Why the shift? Why the sea change? Why do the tectonic plates move in American opinion? Some historians argued in the years that followed World War I that the essential story of the period 1914 to 1917 is the ultimate failure of neutrality practices adopted. They are supposedly badly designed, and they failed to keep the country out of war because of this terrible engineering. These historians, Harry Elmer Barnes, Charles Beard, and others in the 1930s, begin from the premise that getting into the war had been a grave mistake. Premises, of course, have a way of filtering evidence while imposing blinders. This school of historical interpretation concluded that the crucial issues had been design and engineering, shoddy and defective. And so if you fast forward the reel of history and go to the 1930s, what you see are congressmen impersonating brick masons. They're building neutrality walls higher and higher and thicker, so that this time around, we won't be affected by the fallout from Europe. This was the essential revisionist historical interpretation of the origins, America's origins in World War I. This time around, we had to build neutrality practices that were comprehensive and that worked. There was, their argument went, an inability, perhaps an unwillingness on the part of President Wilson and his advisors to adopt workable neutrality practices. The 1930s illustrates as well as any period in our history how history can be used and misused, and how it can serve as an apologia for those who have certain premises, certain convictions that others don't necessarily share. This is the origin of that great struggle between the isolationists and the interventionists on the eve of World War II, with Lindbergh and his followers on one side, and people like Walter Lippmann and others on the other side. That being said, why did this profound shift occur. Historians would give their own version of why in the 30s, and it would be a powerful support for those who wanted to stay out of the next World War. Let's look at 5 plausible determinants, all potentially reinforcing. And some of these I pluck out of the historical mists. For example, number 1, the propaganda war that the combatants, particularly England and Germany, undertook to win the hearts and minds of the American people between 1914 and 1917. Secondly, the nature and the impact of the war trade. A war trade that would achieve a central place in the historical writings of the 1930s. And then a third determinant, calculations of national interest and national security, which really was in an era of stunted development. And then the 2 final determinants, which I will look at closely at the end of the week, and bear with me, there will be certain threads of narrative that I will pick up, let drop, and then pick up again later in the week, because these lectures are meant to be part of a whole. And you're just getting one installment now. So the 4th determinant, which we will excavate later, is the advice which Wilson received from his advisors, including the most improbable Colonel Edward House. And then the really elusive topic, which I'll wrestle with on Friday, and that's the personality and self-image of Wilson himself. What then were the content and effect of propaganda cranked out by the 2 opposing sides in their respective campaigns to win over the American public? I'll give this a very quick brush. Start with British propaganda and then go to German propaganda, but steal my own thunder by saying in advance that both were remarkably high-powered sales campaigns. It's one of the misimpressions I think we have of the period 1914 to 1917, that the Germans weren't actively trying to keep us out of the war. They too had a large propaganda machine operating out of the German Hamburg line in New York City, whereas the British had their secret agency at Wellington House near Victoria Station. Now, when you weigh who's involved in these operations, it would seem that the British have the better of it. After all, Wellington House fills up with remarkable recruits, the Oxbridge crowd, a young, soon-to-be famous British historian, Arnold Toynbee, will be at the center of this propaganda campaign. And it also brings in other literary lights like H.G. Wells and John Galsworthy and Rudyard Kipling and Arnold Bennett. Even a cranky George Bernard Shaw offers his services for a while. You can't expect him to hang around for too long. He didn't get along too well with people. But for a while, his job was to manipulate whatever needed to be manipulated to get the Americans to see that it was in their interest to join the Allies. Medium is the message in lectures, tracts. But eclipsing all of these in importance and fame, if not infamy, is the so-called Bryce Report. So named for a report of a commission headed by Lord James Bryce, himself a distinguished scholar, former ambassador to the United States, authority on American politics, and author of an enduring study of American government, which I had to read when I was an undergraduate, The American Commonwealth. Given his many influential American friends, no Englishman inspired more trust on this side of the Atlantic than did James Bryce. His name certified the authenticity of the report's contents. The reports detailed Germany's alleged atrocities and war crimes in Belgium. It was a lurid tale of violated women, often nuns, and bayoneted babies. Yet for many cruelties cited, and of course the Germans were culpable of cruelties, no proof was offered. Some claims were false, others rested on hearsay or second or even third-hand accounts, and the American public seems to have believed the report's findings with its images of fiendish piano-playing butchers from Berlin. In the short, I like that image, with a Prussian hat on. In the short run, atrocity stories did play in Peoria. But in the long run, the subsequently discredited report contributed to a general disbelief of the Holocaust during World War II. For some Americans, it conditioned their later response to real wartime horrors when stories of genocide were discounted as, quote, just another Wellington House fabrication, unquote. So the sins of the fathers are often visited upon their children. And this wasn't an innocent, inconsequential exercise in propaganda. It too cast its shadow into the 30s and the 40s. Lord Bryce's involvement in the affair was a case of the treason of the intellectual. In choosing between truth and the state, he chose the state, and understandably so. England was fighting for its life, and certain things had to be sacrificed. The first casualty of any war, the truth. Now, the Germans in World War I did execute civilian hostages. They did engage in the wanton destruction of the Louvain Library in Belgium. They did introduce chemical warfare using chlorine and phosgene and mustard gas. And they did execute Edith Cavell, a British nurse caught in subversive activities, though the spin on Edith was she was as innocent as the driven snow. And German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg did utter an unfortunate turn of phrase referring to the 1839 treaty which guaranteed Belgian neutrality as, quote, a scrap of paper, unquote. All of these are grist for the Wellington House mill. Now, on the other side, the German propaganda drive commences in August of 1914. German Information Service is established under a wonderfully Teutonic name. Herr Dr. Heinrich Albert, who will oversee the German counterpart to Wellington House, the German Information Service. There are no serious obstacles to German propagation of its propaganda efforts in the United States until 1915, when, how would I put it, the absent-mindedness factor plays a big role. Indeed, between 1915 and 1917, the absent-mindedness factor will play an important role in two episodes in German-American relations. Suffice it to discuss the first one now. On the afternoon of July 24th, 1915, Albert left his office and headed home with a briefcase in hand, stuffed with papers dealing with his bureau's most secret activities. He boarded a streetcar on the 6th Avenue elevated train in New York City, Manhattan. When the train halted at his stop, he got off. Absent-mindedly, he left his briefcase behind. The New York City rapid transit system seems to have rattled its users long before it unnerved a man named Bernard Goetz. It unnerved Heinrich Albert. What happened next was a great boon to Wellington House because U.S. Treasury agents shadowing Albert swooped down, retrieved the forgotten briefcase, and before long, Secretary of the Treasury, who happened to be Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, William Gibbs McAdoo, no relation, turned the brown leather bag's contents over to the editor of the New York World. Yeah. And in the first installment in mid-August, the Albert exposures played out tabloid style for weeks. So you can easily conclude that the German propaganda effort operated under certain heavy liabilities thereafter. But the British had a way of salvaging Germany's problems, or at least undermining some of those problems. Because after April of 1916, what happened in April of 1916? Anybody? The Irish Rebellion in Dublin, the bloody Easter Uprising. And after that, the German Information Service capitalized skillfully on the suppression of the Irish Rebellion by British troops. Large in number and politically influential Irish Americans shared no affection for the British beforehand, and this only made matters worse. So you can see many of the forces at play between 1914 and 1917. If you are Irish in Boston, you're not at all inclined to join the Allied cause once the sod is bloodied. Now, the British probably got the better of it in the campaign, in the propaganda wars, but not so much as to hasten America's involvement on the Allied side. Maybe the image is that the public listed somewhat under the influence, but propaganda doesn't strike me as at all a critical factor. The economic factor, however, seems a more promising line of investigation. Why? Because the United States profited in a most uneven-handed manner from Europe's self-destruction. Italicize that. The United States profited profoundly from Europe's self-destruction. Perhaps the central reality of the European war for a supposedly neutral America was that it greatly stimulated production and profits at home. It generated a boom. To facilitate its buying spree, Whitehall selected the House of Morgan as its purchasing agent in the United States. And when the Allies eventually ran out of cash or blue chip stocks as collateral, the war trade was made possible by large private loans, with J.P. Morgan arranging the largest foreign loans up until that time in Wall Street's history. This is what got the attention of Gerald P. Nye and others who put together investigating committees in the Congress to find out what was the connection between all of this private investment, all of this trade, and all of these profits with the eventual American involvement in World War I. From August 1914 until April 1917, the Allies borrowed, through bond flotations mainly, approximately $2.5 billion. Multiply it by 15 or 20 for today's version. At a time when the value of American exports to Europe jumped from $500 million to $3.5 billion in value. And that favorable balance of trade, which we probably will never see again in our time, that favorable balance of trade redounded dramatically to the advantage of the home economy. During that same period, American investors lent to Germany only $27 million. This unequal ratio, this staggering inequality, was 100 to 1. So when you heard Germans cry out that American neutrality was really benevolent neutrality, this, of course, had considerable basis in fact. All those commercial and financial transactions involved a staggering transfer of wealth. We are one of the milestones in American history. We are at one of those, what the Germans would call Wendepunkts, turning points. Under this remarkable war trade with the movement of capital across the Atlantic, the United States goes from its traditional status as a debtor nation to its status as a creditor nation and the world's leading financial power. It all comes about under the complex and variegated transactions that are orchestrated by the House of Morgan during World War I. Historian David Fromkin, who, by the way, wrote a wonderful book on World War I's consequences for the Middle East, I think, the Peace That Ended All Peace, I think the title of it was. Wonderful. The Peace That Ended All Peace. At any rate, David Fromkin has described this transfer, this huge transfer of wealth that went on between 1914 and 1919, as perhaps the largest transfer of wealth in a short time that the world had ever known. These are not simple garden variety transactions. These are transactions that are shaking the financial and economic foundations of the United States. We will never be the same again, and the world will never perceive us again the same way. In the 1920s and 1930s, you have this great disconnect. We have become a financial and economic colossus, with J.P. Morgan, the symbol in finance, and Henry Ford, the symbol of mass production of automobiles. We have become a financial colossus, but we have stayed the hand of any political commitments. You have an economic revolution and a political stagnation. Well, not surprising, because in American universities we begin to teach politics as if it's something separate from economics. Nobody teaches political economy. You have a politics department and an economics department. What is happening in the 20s and 30s is this disconnect between politics and economics, between the buying and selling and investing and the negotiating and compromising that is the essence of politics. So, did a one-sided war trade and war loans heavily favoring the Allies and that linked American prosperity and repayment to Allied victory on the battlefield push the United States into war to protect its investment? That is the essential thesis of those who subscribed in the 1930s to the so-called merchants of death thesis. Its subscribers blamed bankers like J.P. Morgan and munition makers like DuPont and Bethlehem Steel for promoting their own profits at the expense of the public good. It is a decidedly populist critique. And it's a populist critique that goes back to the 1890s. It's a populist critique that has great staying power and is still with us today. The bankers are to blame. The big businessmen are to blame. They're the ones who pushed aside the public good and the common weal and promoted their own interest at the great expense of the common man. Whatever its truthfulness or untruthfulness, this theory, this thesis, best explains, as I mentioned earlier, America's new neutrality, where we're not going to do anything that runs the risk of getting involved in what's going on in Europe as Hitler begins to rampage and other desperado nations begin their aggressions. In a nutshell, the new neutrality does in fact facilitate the rise of Nazi Germany in Europe. But I would argue that that merchants of death thesis has never explained adequately our entry into World War I, because it has never compellingly explained Woodrow Wilson's role in that shift from isolationism to combat on the Western Front. Wilson claimed that Germany's violation of America's neutral rights was the primary cause for the declaration of war, especially Berlin's new tactic of submarine warfare. And that's the topic I'd like to give a glancing blow to now. In a legal sense, the clock has been turned back. In another sense, the clock timing the advance of science and technology can never be turned back. Complicating everything was that technological advances in naval warfare had raced ahead of what little existing international law there was. Those laws were out of date. New weapons had their own logic. A U-boat was no conventional warship like a cruiser. Indeed, its greatest asset was its ability to strike without warning. It was the original stealth weapon. Demanding that U-boats abide by cruiser rules of warfare, or rules of cruiser warfare, raised serious problems. Why? Those rules required a submarine commander to visit and search and provide provision for the safety of passengers and crew on any merchant ship before it was sunk. It's a law clearly overtaken by technology. It was suicidal for a U-boat captain to comply with these rules, even though Wilson insisted they do so. Surfacing left him vulnerable to ramming, as well as making him a sitting duck for concealed deck guns or armed merchantmen flying neutral flags, a ruse the British, oh perfidious Albion, fighting for their lives, adopted. So if you're a U-boat commander, your hands seem to be tied. You've got a weapon, but its effectiveness is now being taken away from you. Likewise, in regard to England, what constituted a valid blockade had been a matter of agreement. And yet the British contended if we have an actual blockade, given all those new weapons, subs, long-range artillery, and sea mines, it's suicidal. So we'll have a paper blockade, and we'll have a blacklist, and we'll make sure that we interdict American commerce, but without blowing up their ships. So both sides are in violation of international law, as murky as that concept was in 1914 and 1915 and 1916. Let me identify those two events which, in the end, pushed the United States into war. The first was the decision, one of many big gambles made by the Germans between 1914 and 1918. It was the fateful decision for unrestricted U-boat warfare. Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Ludendorff, facing a stalemated land war, approved the German Navy's proposal for an all-out U-boat campaign. And the decision was announced on January 31st. It was a bet. Indeed, the Germans bet all their marks that the Allies would surrender in 6 months. Never listened to the Navy. The Navy had told them, we can get it done in 6 months, so take the chance. We can win the war before America could make a difference. It's now, henceforth, U-boats begin to attack in wholesale fashion neutral and belligerent shipping, including all United States shipping. A 2-year grace period had ended. Wilson, showing how reluctant he was, adopted a policy of armed neutrality. It failed. More American ships were sunk. And finally, without any other recourse, he decides that he must turn to full-scale belligerency. Doing so, though, was made a lot easier by two events. One, a telegram sent by Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary, a telegram that offered, it was a secret telegram, but British codebreakers in a wonderful cryptanalytic feat broke it and revealed its contents to President Wilson, who made it available to the Associated Press. And in the telegram, the Germans offer the Mexican government, in the event that they join with the Germans in war against the United States, the return of the lost territories. All you Texans, hold on tight. They were going to get back, Mexicans were going to get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. If they, of course, on the assumption that the coalition of Mexico and Germany won the war. Well, needless to say, this created an enormous uproar in the United States when it was announced. And by the way, it was announced within a few weeks of the decision at Pless for unrestricted U-boat warfare. It's now that you can sense the synergy. Americans are beginning to rethink the appropriateness of neutrality and neutralism. And then, finally, as if the script was written by Hollywood, the one final push in the direction toward belligerency takes place in Russia. It comes in March in the overthrow of the Tsar and his reactionary regime, and the establishment of a provisional government under Alexander Kerensky. This seeming movement toward democracy, everything looks so hopeful. We know it quickly goes into the commode, but it looks very hopeful, so hopeful that the American government extends loans that total $325 million to help the fledgling Kerensky government make it through the hard times. The American government believes that this change in government, which only proved temporary, removed the taint of waging war on the side of an authoritarian Russia, and it removed an obstacle to finally picking sides. The end of the road to war had been reached for America. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes for questions. Yes, Ramsey.
My question is about the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. How do you...
Great question, because it's the section I skipped over. Now I can get to it. Thank you. Would you tell everybody I did not ask you to ask this? Never has so much been made of something that was so inconsequential in bringing the United States into the war. May of 1915, this remarkable Cunard luxury liner with about 1,900 passengers and crew on it was heading toward Liverpool from England, from New York, and was torpedoed off the Irish coast with a great loss of life and an incredible uproar in the press. But remember, this is May of 1915. We declare war in April of 1917. This is more than 2 years later. A lot of buffs tend to conflate these two events, but in fact, I find very little effect on the decision to go to war in the Lusitania. But Lusitania, nonetheless, when it sank, became encrusted with more than barnacles. It became encrusted with its own conspiracy theories. And there is a lingering conspiracy theory hatched back in the 1970s by a British journalist named Colin Simpson that the Lusitania was used as bait by, guess who? This is the toaster theory of history. Winston Churchill, he pops up again. He's responsible for setting up the Lusitania. Well, if you go at the Lusitania story with an open mind, what you find is that the culprit in that tragedy was the captain of the Lusitania, a guy named William Turner, Captain Turner, because he was guilty of the sorriest seamanship one could imagine. He did everything wrong, everything wrong. And if I had more time, I could itemize all the mistakes he made. But, and then there's the extraordinary element of chance. Kapitan Leutnant Schwieger, who was the commander of the U-20 that sank the Lusitania off the Irish coast, He fired one torpedo. It was unbelievable. It's like I took a shot from half court and it went in. So it hits the starboard side. For conspiracy theorists, I must now reveal the fact that in the cargo hold of the Lusitania, a passenger ship, the fastest and grandest of its time, there were 4,500 cases of rifle ammunition. And that's why the ship went down in 18 minutes. 18 minutes. Turner had not conducted any abandonment procedures. And so, but it didn't really matter, because once that secondary explosion went up, the ship was down. So, but the Brits were using passenger liners to send contraband across the Atlantic. So this wasn't Churchill's decision. This was a policy of Whitehall and the British government. So what I say in conclusion is that no, if you look closely, you can't find Churchill's hand, visible or not. But what you do find is terrible seamanship by Captain Turner. And to make it even more galling, he was one of the 800 rescued. He didn't go down with his ship. Yeah. Turner, William Turner. Not a hero. Yes.
Could you give us a couple examples of how the Germans tried to influence American public opinion?
Generally, they subsidize ostensibly neutral writers. They got George Verrick being one of them. He was a leading German-American intellectual at the time. They created a stable of writers whose job it was to spin pro-German stories and to give the best possible take. They had a lecture circuit where they sent out speakers whose job it was to be fair and balanced, but who were anything but fair and balanced about Germany. Bribes, but in those days it was more conventional stuff: lectures, tracts, letters to the editor, brochures.
Fox News.
Well, there's in the 20th century there have always been spin machines, and the German information service was a spin machine, and Wellington House was an equally adept spin machine. And by the way, the British continue in World War II. They get a Canadian named William Stevenson, whose job it is to do exactly what Wellington House had attempted between 1914 and 1917, a man called Intrepid. Yes, Andrew.
How much do you think that the Zimmermann telegram had to do with the fact that the American army in Mexico was inept, and the invasion of Veracruz was actually poorly done? It looked like we had no idea what we were doing.
Right, right.
And what's going on at the time of the telegram?
Well, I think it's hard to figure out what Arthur Zimmermann was thinking. For one thing, he wasn't thinking. The word Bosch comes to mind. For example, when the press got a hold of the deciphered telegram that room 40OB that the Admiralty had revealed, and by the way, the absent-mindedness factor enters in here. A man with the most improbable name, a German agent, Wilhelm Wasmus, left behind his briefcase as he was heading down the Tigris from Constantinople. Trailing him at the time were British agents, including Kim Philby's father, St. John Philby. And they get his carpet bag, they send it on a hope and a prayer. They send it to London, and in it they find the code book used for diplomatic encipherments between Germany and Mexico City. And then they go to work and unbutton, put into plain text the telegram. But Zimmermann, it's announced to the public that this telegram has been uncovered. All Zimmermann had to do was say, I know nothing, like Schultz. I know nothing. But no, he says, yes, I wrote this telegram, and I'm proud of it. But whether he thought Mexico was a legitimate ally to fight alongside with, it may have been that the futility of Pershing's punitive raid and the inability to track down and capture the thug Pancho Villa was an incentive, yes. But I have no, it's plausible, but I have no evidence for that. Yes?
What is the name of the woman, I believe in Congress, who railed?
Jeanette Rankin.
Yep.
Jeanette Rankin has the honor of being the first female congresswoman, came in from Montana, and she was one of the 50 who voted against the war. And what other accolade in some circles did she acquire? She then voted against the war in World War II. Yes, of the 50, the first female congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin, voted nay.
Wow.
Yes, ma'am.
You and I spoke about this yesterday evening. It's about the Zimmermann telegram. My family home is on the Arizona-Mexican border, so the Zimmermann telegram had direct impact.
Hot times in the old town tonight, huh?
Yes, absolutely. Because at this time, all of us along that border, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, we were in all-out battle with Pancho Villa. And my family was on both sides of that border. On the American side, we were way down in Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Sonora. And Pancho Villa was not that nice a chap. The dilemma for Wilson is he had to choose between Pancho Villa and Carranza. Neither were a very savory character. In the end, Wilson chose to support Carranza against Pancho Villa, and Pancho Villa was a very vengeful character. So he turned on the American engineers that were down there working on the railroads and the mines. And there was a trainload of people going back in to work on the mines. And the American engineers were separated from everyone else. And they weren't just lined up and shot, they were literally massacred. And the only reason we know about it is because one of the engineers survived and was able to report the story. That hit the American press. And everybody was sort of like...
Have you ever run across anything that would suggest that the Berlin was aware of what was going on along the Mexican-American border?
Yeah, because the Germans were in Mexico.
Well, the Germans had advisors, but...
Yeah, there were several promises with the Zimmermann telegram, because what's interesting is Carranza did not dismiss the telegram. He actually turns it over to his generals to see if it's actually feasible to take up the offer. And the generals did study this because they've always had a hankering to reclaim their lost lands from the, as a result of the Treaty of Hidalgo. There were two main reasons why they chose not to follow through the Zimmermann telegram and collaborate with the Germans. One, they were not assured that the Germans would come across with the armament, advisors, and the money. The second reason, and the main reason why Mexico elected not to invade the southwestern part of the United States, was because they decided it would be very difficult to suppress an indigenous population where everybody was armed.
Okay, I'm going to have to give you part of my salary, thank you. Any other questions?
I want to finish this.
Wait. We must, in the interest of fair play, we must open this up. Any other questions? Are we ready for coffee? You and I will talk later.